Okay, so once again, we have this relationship. In this case, I just have the risk-free on the left-hand side, but it's the same idea. CAPM predicts a linear relationship between a stock's beta and its excess return. Practically, testing CAPM means testing whether the equation holds. The focus on is usually where there's an excess return. In many empirical finance paper, what you want to show is that you can find something other than CAPM, right? There's an extra term. Okay. Ideally, you want to be able to say when this extra term would be positive. That's the best. There's a financial website called Seeking Alpha, right? That's what it is referring to. Because if alpha is positive, that means that the stock that you are picking, have extra return over what CAPM model predicts it would have. So you are earning extra, right? So that's why you want to seek alpha, right? But as a finance researcher, what you want to look at is, well, your CAPM says there's nothing here. My regression shows that there is something here, which already tells you CAPM is not correct. So is there anything here? That's one thing that you can look for. And you can look at this graphically. This is what you would see if you plot companies along a line according to on a diagram according to their market beta and the excess return. CAPM would say they should line up on a straight line. In practice, they don't line up a straight line. What you see would be would be sort of a convex function. Stocks that have high market beta also have higher return than CAPM suggests. Right? So that's what. So you have and then stocks that have high beta. You see the ones that have higher than 1, they would have higher return than what CAPM suggests. Right? So this is the primary anomaly that you want to explain when you start from CAPM, because the most obvious violation of CAPM would be the fact that these companies with high beta have higher return on average than what CAPM model suggests. If you look at low beta ones, then it's not that much of a problem. The high beta ones are the problem, right? So focus on this part. Companies with high beta. What companies do you think have high beta? So remember, beta is just basically the correlation of your stock return with the market stock return, right? So high beta means your stock have high correlation with the market. So what type of stocks do you think? Tech companies, well, now some tech companies have high correlations with the market simply because they are kind of big, right? But even if a company is very big, its correlation with the stock market as a whole cannot be over 1, right? Because let's say I'm so big that I'm the whole market, then the correlation would simply be 1, right? These companies are actually having beta higher than 1. So it cannot just be stock company, right? There's something more than that. So because Google is a stock company, right? So and they have many other stock companies that are smaller too. So now let's just think about if a company actually have beta bigger than 1. That means that if the stock market goes up 10%, it's going to go up 15 or 20 or 30%. If the stock market goes down 10%, it's going to go down 20 or 30%, right? Do you think this type of company is going to be Google? No, right? Yeah. Typically, these are small companies, which is why they can have such drastic price movements, right? Google is not going to do that. Like Apple, Microsoft, 3M, GE, these are not companies that would have such behavior, right? It's small companies that could behave like this. So that's one part of the explanation we're going to have is that small companies behave differently from big companies, right? Right. So stocks with small market value have returns higher than the predictions of CAPM, which means if you have a trading strategy that focus on investing in small firms, you will already have higher return than the overall market. This is known, right? This is known. If you invest just in small companies, obviously you don't want to invest in just one of them, right? That's very risky. Let's just say you have a representative portfolio of many small companies, then on average, you will earn higher return than the market as a whole. So generally in empirical finance, you are looking for factors that would give you extra return over CAPM. Yeah. So that could be things like, as we will talk about later on in the course, it could be things like weather, it could be things like football match, it could be many different things. Empirical finance is a field that is very set on finding factors that can give you extra return, right? So in some sense, it's a very practical field. You keep looking for factors that can help you predict the stock market, right? So here we have one: small firms. Small firms give you higher return. Now, all right. So now, this is a paper published in 1991 on Japan stock return, right? So, and it lists out several factors that offer things are indicative. So, size, earnings per share, earnings over price, cash flow over price, and book to market ratio. And in these cases, the bars all represent average return of the stock, you can see that. So the bars height are average return. You have it's a 3D diagram. So you have one axis here that shows you it splits all stocks. It splits all stocks into 5 groups. Now, first there's one group that has negative or 0 for these ratios, which is weird, right? Because now think about what it means, right? 0 or negative, that means you have no cash flow or even negative cash flow. 0 would mean you have no earnings or even negative earnings, right? So now this one is the one that's missing because it's impossible to have 0 size in the stock market. So there's nothing here, right? So these are weird cases, right? Negative cash flow, negative earnings, negative book value, weird. So then for the firms that are normal with positive statistics here, right? Positive statistics here, then you would that offer split them into 4 groups from the lowest to the highest. Okay. Now, let's start with this one, these ones, because it's quite obvious. Of all the bars here, the highest return is obtained with these weird cases. The ones with negative cash flow, the one with negative earnings, and the ones with negative book value. They have the highest return. Does that make sense? Why does it make sense? Do you want to buy these firms? Do you want to buy these companies? No. Think about it. A company that has negative earnings, negative cash flow, negative book value probably means it's a firm that is probably going to be bankrupt. These are distressed firms, right? Distressed firms have very high return to compensate for the risks involved. This is average, right? Like if you are in the industry of buying distressed firms, then out of 20 firms you buy, maybe 1 firm would actually give you this return, right? Will give you a high return. All the other ones will fail. So you need a very high return to compensate the investors for the risk they take on, because 9 out of 10 of these firms will fail. That's why. So this is actually makes a lot of sense. This is the premium that is needed to attract investors to invest in distressed firms. That makes a lot of sense. But what about these ones? Let's look at I think the one that is, we want to talk about first is the size. Companies that are smallest also have the highest return. Companies that are biggest have the lowest return. Does that make sense to you? Why? How would you explain that? So you think it's about mispricing? Okay, that's one possibility. Actually, we'll see later on when we talk about Anna's recommendation that small companies are much more price sensitive to any information than big companies, right? But yeah, so how would you feel investing in, let's say, HSBC versus investing in a company that you have never heard about? Which one are you more comfortable in? Probably HSBC, right? So part of the reason is the small firms being obscure are some sense perhaps more risky, right? You have lack of information, so you don't really know what's going on. So in order to attract investors, you have to have high return, right? So that's one possibility. All right. What about, so companies with high earnings have higher return, higher cash flow have higher return, higher book value also have higher return. Now, okay. Do they make sense to you? Do they make sense to you? Why do they make sense to you? Okay. So I think the key question to ask for these three cases is: Do you think these companies? Well, let me just ask this way: Will you invest in these companies, right? The ones with the highest book to market ratio, the highest cash flow, or the highest earnings? Are you going to invest in these companies? Yes. Why? Right. The thing is, how do you know these companies are not really that much different from the ones here? Right. I mean, these companies have very high return, but you know that because they are very risky. How do you know these companies are not similar? That their high return is simply to compensate for the risk involved in investing in them. So I guess the question really is: Do you think these companies are risky? Companies with high book value, companies with high cash flow, and companies with high earnings. Do you think they're risky? Maybe, right? Maybe.
Either they have a lot of very high earnings or they have a very low price.
Right. One more question is you have to ask is, if this company has such high earnings, how come the market is assigning such a low price to it? Right. Now, so one possibility is there's actually some risk involved in this company. I have to answer that. Now, there is actually no good answer for this one because this question is central to basically kind of what camp you are in finance. Now, if you are Eugene Fama who proposed efficient market hypothesis, then you shouldn't have a situation where companies that are perfectly normal suddenly have higher return, right? That's money on the table, and that's not allowed under efficient market hypothesis, right? Because if these companies are perfectly healthy and normal and safe, and they have such high returns, how come investors are not flocking to them? If investors are flocking to them, then the P would go up, reducing this ratio, right? So that's why, from the perspective of Eugene Fama, he would be skeptical of whether this is actually represent worthwhile investment. But if you're in the perspective of, but this argument could be applied to any anomaly you find, right? You can always ask this question: why market forces has not eliminated the anomaly you observe. So if you're in a camp where you would call yourself a behavioral finance guy, then you might think that these truly represent opportunities to invest, that they are actually truly normal and safe companies, but somehow they have persistently high return. I don't think this is a settled question, right? I don't think this is a settled question. So, but empirically, it is true that on average, companies with high book to market ratio, high cash flow to price ratio, and high earnings to price ratio, plus being small, they have higher returns. This is has been very well established. Not just in Japan, of course, but also in most countries in the world. The reason why I showed the one in Japan is simply I find this diagram to be the nicest. Yeah. Right. So Eugene Fama's explanation is it's all about risk. There must be some underlying risk involved in these companies. Right. So Eugene Fama doesn't actually, I don't think he actually have a very good idea of what the risk is. He simply, like, to him, efficient market hypothesis implies that if these companies have high return, they must have higher risk. Right? That's just a natural implication of an efficient market. So what exactly the risks are, I don't think he has a very good idea. Right? So he has offered. So we will be talking about some of his paper probably in the next class. Yeah, it's time's up. So, but basically, he would think that once it's basically the story that we have just mentioned is that if the market is assigning such a low price, there must be some risk involved. Yeah. So okay, so I think we're going to stop here today. Next week we're going to talk about exactly which one of these are most important and how do people test these and so on. Right. So just going to see you next week. Wait, no, I'm not going to see you next week. Chinese New Year. So I'm going to see you the week after. Don't come back. Right. In any case, the empirical phenomenon is companies with low market value, so we typically call those small cap, right? Remember, this is not talking about the stock price. right? So this small cap is not the same as penny stock, right? Penny stock refers to companies with very low stock price, whereas small cap refers to company with a small market capitalization. They could have very high price per share, but with few shares outstanding, resulting in a low market capitalization, right? So small cap means low market capitalization, as well as companies with high book to market ratio. These are called value stocks sometimes. The idea being, book value tells you what the company is worth in theory, right? Market value tells you what the company is worth in actual. So if book value is high relative to the market value, it's kind of like you're getting a bargain, right? Yeah, and then high earnings yield stocks and high cash flow yield stocks are outperforming CAPM's prediction. That's what we're going to investigate, right? So these companies, basically, as you see in the previous diagram, somehow have higher return. Okay, so how do you actually test if there's some sort of anomaly over CAPM, right? Over CAPM. So finance paper in this area typically have one of the following objectives in mind. One, you want to argue that there are risk factors not captured by CAPM, right? So you want to say CAPM only captures market risk, right? Every stock's return is related to the market's return by how much it is correlated with the market return. Maybe you want to say there are other risk factors other than market risk, and they actually also affect stock price. So that's one thing. And investors demand return for these risks. This second objective would be to argue that there are profitable trading strategies that investors can exploit. You want to look for anomalies that actually earns you higher profit. So there are these two objectives in mind. Now, these two objectives are mostly ideological difference, right? If you are in the camp of efficient market, then you would say you're looking for risk factors. If you're in a behavioral camp, then you would say you're looking for profitable opportunities. These are ideological differences because the statistical analysis are practically the same in either case. It's basically just how you interpret the findings that differs. So how do you test whether you have abnormal return? Well, it involves three parts. One is data. You need good data. And I'm going to introduce the data set to you in a moment. And we're actually going to use it maybe next time, maybe next week after we cover this part. Next week, then I would just remind everyone to bring the laptop and we'll try to download data from Wharton. So you need good data, and I will explain why the data is good in a moment. Then once you have data, you need a rule to test. Like, how do you actually establish that an effect exists, right? And how do you test it? Well, how do you test it? Like, so what do you want to test, and how do you test it? Okay, so now I'm going to introduce the data. In finance research, there are different ways you can get your data. So we're going to focus on academic research because if you are in commercial, you would use your needs would be different. Okay. So as a student, the first stop you might want to consider is Yahoo Finance. The primary reason being it's free, right? And you can just access it online. Right, so it's very easy to download historical stock price from Yahoo. We can do that. But if we have time, we can try to do that today. We can do it next week. But it's very easy to download stock price from Yahoo, and it's completely free. So what's the problem with using Yahoo Finance? One first problem is if you're doing this manually, like clicking through the website, you can only download one stock at a time, right? You can download the prices of one stock at a time. So if you want a representative portfolio of the market, you have to click through different stocks and download them manually. If you are capable of programming, then you can write a simple script to comb through Yahoo to download the data for you. This is particularly easy in Hong Kong because stocks in Hong Kong are simply ordered by numbers, right? So you just start from 0001 and go all the way to like 10,000, and then we download all the stocks in Hong Kong for you. For US, it's a bit more complicated because in US you have tickers, right? Things like Apple is AAPO, like Intel is INTO, right? So you don't have a simple numerical system. That makes it more difficult. But that's actually not the biggest problem. And what the actual problem is for academic research, I'll mention in a moment. All right. So a better choice is DataStream, Thomas Rutter's DataStream. DataStream is a subscription service used by both academia and commercial users. You have to access it through dedicated computers in the university library or in our computer lab upstairs on the 9th floor. So there are only 3 places you can access DataStream on campus. One is in the university library, at the main library. One is somewhere in the finance department, and the third is our department in the economics department upstairs in 909, room 909. Good thing about DataStream: broad range of global financial data, very comprehensive. It's after all, it's used by practitioners too. So and you pay money for it, so it's a very good data source. The downside, the interface is not particularly user-friendly, I'd say. You have to access it through an Excel add-in. Well, it's not very user-friendly compared to what we're gonna use later on in the moment. We'll talk about that in a moment, as well as versus Bloomberg. In the past, the department does not have Bloomberg, and library does not have Bloomberg too. So the only place you can get Bloomberg access on campus is the finance department's trading lab, which you can enter, but the rest cannot. So that's not a viable source for most of our students. But starting since last year, we have Bloomberg terminals in the economics department too, and it's open 24/7 if you're a student in the department. So Bloomberg, I would say, it's actually easier to use. So it's open 24/7, provided that you can enter the building. Right? The building does not open 24/7. So if you're inside the building, the lab is free access during the day and key card access during the night. Right? So you just have to figure out a way to get inside the building. We don't care if you stay overnight. Yeah. Right. So that's so DataStream or Bloomberg is what practitioners would use. Now, for academia, what we're gonna use, where we're gonna get out most of our data is from Wharton Research Data Service, WRDS. Now, this is an online portal for downloading data. So it's not actually a data provider. It doesn't collect its own data. It's simply a place to store data that you can download. Obviously, this service costs money, and the university has already paid for it. So free access for you all. The website is wrds.wharton.upenn.edu, which we were going to actually use later on. So good thing. Centralized online source for multiple data sets, many data sets, right? Institution subscription, free for you to use. And with an audit are some of the most commonly used data sets, which the first one being the data from the Center for Research in Security Prices. So most people just call it CRIPS. The CRIPS data set. So this, the Center for Research in Security Prices is based in University of Chicago, and it simply basically collects stock prices. It covers all three major U.S. stock exchange, NYSE, AMEX, and NASDAQ. Comprehensive daily stock price data dating back to 1970s. Right. So this is the reason why most academic studies in finance starts with 1970s. That's because the CRIPS data only starts from 1970s. That's the reason why. We have data going further back, but it's not from CRIPS, and there are problems when you're not using CRIPS data. Okay, so why is CRIPS so good that everyone would prefer to stick with CRIPS? Now, first, the data is actually very simple. It contains only what you can also find in Yahoo Finance, like high, low, closing, volume in a day, dividends, and split. These you can all find in Yahoo too, right? So it's just stock price data. It doesn't contain accounting information at all, right? Just stock price data. The most important feature that makes that everyone is using CRIPS for is the fact that it's survival bias free. This is extremely important. Now, what is survival bias? Survival bias is the phenomenon that you are only analyzing companies that exist at the moment of observation. Now, the company that exists at the moment of observation is not a random sample of all companies in history, right? Companies exist because they have not gone bankrupt. And that probably means they are doing something right? Companies that are really bad would have disappeared, right? So if you use Yahoo Finance, which only contains currently listed companies, you will be analyzing only companies that have survived till now, and you would not observe any companies that have failed along the way. This would bias your analysis, right? Okay. For example, let's just have a very simple example. Suppose you have two types of companies. Type A use very risky strategies, right? Have very risky businesses, and type B has very safe business. Now, if you use Yahoo Finance, you would realize that risky strategy would be very profitable, right? Why? Because perhaps half the companies, or even 90% of the companies that use risky strategy have failed. But on Yahoo Finance, you only find the 10% that survived, right? So what you would discover is, actually, it's a good business practice to use the risky strategy, which is a wrong conclusion. Because if your data is actually survival bias free, you would observe that 90% of the company that use the risky strategy have failed. This is the reason why you have to use a data set like CRIPS that is survival bias free. The data set is painstakingly maintained to ensure that every company that ever exists is in the data. Right? So companies that have bankrupt, merged, acquired, they are all in the data. Right? And they have multiple identifiers to let you know what happened to the company. So that's the reason why everyone uses this data. Right. So virtually all research on U.S. stock market would be using CRIPS. So this is going to be this is the standard. Okay, as I've mentioned, the CRIPS data does not contain any accounting information, and it's not very interesting if you just have stock price. So you need accounting information, things like book value, cash flow, earnings. Where do you get those? Well, you get those from S&P's CompuStat. So CompuStack is a comprehensive data source. It contains price data, which no one uses because everyone uses scripts. Right? CompuStack is also it's just like DataStream and it's like DataStream, right? It's used by both academia and practitioners. So practitioners would not use CRIPS. The reason is CRIPS is geared towards academia. You need all these painstaking maintenance, which means it's nowhere close to real time. We're talking about at least a year in delay, right? So if you access CRIPS right now, you probably only get up to 2017 or at most 2008. Yeah, I would say 2017 data, right? So this is not useful for practitioners, right? Because my investment strategy cannot be dependent on data that is 2 years old. So CRIPS is only for research. That's why there are services like DataStream and CompuStack that offers much more up-to-date prices. So this is not used by researchers, but practitioners might need them. Furthermore, because CRIPS only contains data on U.S. stock prices, if you are doing research on international stock markets, then you cannot use CRIPS. So CompuStack is one place you can go, although I would say it's usually better if you just fetch your own data from either Bloomberg or DataStream than using the CompuStack data from WRDS. Okay, the most important part why people want CompuStack is for the company information and fundamentals. This part is well maintained by S&P. That means that they have standardized all items across companies, because different companies would report different things, right? I mean, there's nothing that says that everyone has to have the exact same format on your financial reports. So if you want to go through financial reports yourself, it's going to be a very painful task. Standard & Poor's have done the hard work for you. So basically, it's a data set with like 500 items, which is standardized across companies. And you just need to you just check different items you need, and you can easily compare across different companies. All right. So things so it's really detailed. As I said, there are hundreds of items ranging from things like book values and sales to rental commitments or even phone numbers and addresses, if that's what you need, right? For example, you might be trying to study how this is actually a study that has been done before, like how the company's headquarters location affects its investment pattern, right? Investors tend to invest companies that are close to them, right? So for that you would need the address or the zip code of a company, right? So that you can get from CompuStack.
Does CompuStack and Bloomberg both have companies that gone bust?
CompuStack does. Bloomberg, I'm not sure whether it actually has company that has already delisted. I'm not sure. Yeah. So my guess is probably not, right? That's my guess though. CompuStack certainly does. This is otherwise it's gonna be pointless, right? If CRIPS have company that has disappeared but not CompuStack, then where are you going to get the accounting information for company that has disappeared? Besides, this is also a long time series of data. So the problem with using something like Yahoo Finance is that it's not like they didn't have the data, right? They did have the data for companies that have disappeared. It's just that they removed those data once the company has disappeared. Whereas for CompuStack, everything is stored on WRDS. You can access. Okay, so the standard practice in finance research for U.S. stock market is to merge the CRIPS and CompuStack data sets together. So what you would have is each observation in your data is going to be the stock price in one day for one company, followed by the financial data that is closest to that date, right? Because financial statements only come quarterly, right? So you would just look for the closest previous financial statement, right? So this part would require you to have some ability to do the data manipulation, like stata or R, because you need to merge the two data sets. Because this is so commonly done, you can actually there are actually files that help you merge the two data sets. Now, basically what you need is because crypts and compustat use different identifiers. Now, you can use the first thing you want to know is that you cannot use ticker. You cannot use the stock market ticker, like as I said, something like AAPL. Why not? You know why not? Why can't you just use ticker? That would be easy, right? Okay, so you have to be a bit familiar with various ways companies list and delist in order to understand why this is problematic. I think the best example is actually GM, General Motors. So General Motors is a large automobile maker in the United States, one of the big three. So what happened during the financial crisis in 2008? GM actually went bust, right? GM actually went bust to the point that the U.S. government needs to, have a bailout, right? Now, today, GM still exists, but in terms of equity, the GM today has nothing to do with the GM before the financial crisis, because all equity has been before the financial crisis has been wiped out during the bailout, right? So despite the fact that you have GM pre-2008 and GM post-2008, both GM make cars, both GM have the same logo. They in terms of investment, it would be extremely wrong to treat them as the same company. So while they have the same ticker, in crypts, they are treated as two companies. The pre-2008 GM and the post-2008 GM have two different identifiers in crypts, right? So this is important. Otherwise, you would reach the wrong conclusion, right? So, crypts and compute. So basically, what you need to do is to use the right identifiers and merge the companies up, right? And there are WRDS have data sets that help you do that. Okay, so remember, this is what everyone uses, right? Each observation would be one day for one company. You have the stock price on that day plus financials from the nearest quarter. Okay? Right. Yes. In fact, a lot of the times you would actually be more stringent than that. Sometimes you would impose limitations, things like perhaps it has to be a month ahead to ensure that the information is actually widely known. Yeah. So it's actually, I would say, it's not common to use the data from yesterday, right? Right. So Thomson Reuters IBES, which stands for Institutional Brokers Estimate System, which, as this name suggests, is analyst forecasts. It's a database of analyst forecasts. It includes forecast of company earnings, company perhaps stock prices in some cases, and recommendation on whether to buy or sell. Right. So we have a class account for WRDS that has just been activated. I have to reactivate it every term. You don't have access by default. It has to. So faculty can request access. Student can only access through class account. But with this, you can always you can access it on this term. So the username is ECON4470, and the password is CUHKEOB403. Right? Okay. So how do you test if there are anomalies relative to the CAPM model? As we have already noted, the CAPM model naturally gives you a linear equation. So you would obviously going to run a linear regression, right? On the left hand side, it's going to be the excess return of a stock, right? On the right hand side, you would have beta. Now you have the vertical intercept, and then you have beta multiplied by the excess return of the market. I think I've explained last time that you could either compute the excess return for the market and estimate beta, or you could compute beta and estimate the market return, right? And what you want to, in either case, what you want to do is to test if the estimated coefficient makes sense or not, right? Is it statistically significant? Whether the value actually makes sense? Now, when you want to test whether something has an effect in excess of the CAPM model, what you do would be to put the extra factor in the regression and see whether the estimated coefficient is statistically significant. So it's a very simple idea. It's a very simple idea in principle. You simply add factors, right? So in this case, I put size, but you could put something like whether the weather is nice or not. Right? The principle is the same. Just put the factors you want to test in the regression. What are some potential statistical issues? The second one? This one? This one? Okay, this one. Now, in earlier days, in the 1990s, people do both. There are people who do one or the other, right? These days, almost everyone would probably compute the excess return and estimate the beta. So these days, I think it's more common to calculate the difference, to calculate the market excess return and estimate beta. This is, I think, is more common nowadays. But in the past, yeah, you could many papers would actually compute beta and estimate this. Yeah, right now I think this is more common. Let beta to be the coefficient. One thing to also note that if you read those papers from the 1990s, is that when they compute the beta, they usually use portfolio beta, not individual stock beta. The reason is that individual stock beta is too noisy. So if you try to estimate beta just based on this single stock, then it changes a lot. So typically what is done is that you would actually group stock by the characteristics and use the portfolio beta. So you're just simply using the beta of a group of stocks that are very similar and use that in the model. Right. So that is what I'm trying to explain. Right. So in earlier studies, it's very common to calculate beta and use it as an independent variable. This is common. Okay. All right. So the first paper I'm going to show you is Fama-French 1992. Now this is not the paper of Fama-French three factors model. That's the next paper. This paper comes before it. So Fama-French 1992. The paper title is Cross Section of Expected Stock Returns. So, and what they want to do is test whether the beta, market equity, book to market ratio, and leverage and earnings and price ratio explain excess return, right? Okay. So here you can see now these are the dependent variables, and beta is here. So this is one example where the beta is calculated and used as a dependent variable, right? So beta It's not estimated in the regression. Beta is calculated by the definition of in CAPM, covariance over variance of market. And this, as I've mentioned, is also based on portfolio, not individual stock. So if you read the paper, what they did is that they sort stocks by into 25 groups, and you would just use the beta from your group, right? Because that's more stable. Okay, so what the numbers reported are estimated effect on individual excess return. So the left-hand side is excess return of the stock, right? So basically what this coefficient tell you is if the effect is positive, if the coefficient is positive, that means that this factor has a positive effect on excess return, and 1 means 1%. So this is just 0.15%, which you think it's not small, right? Because stock return is on average in the whole stock market on average is something like 11 to 15%. So 0.15% is nothing to say, and it's like 1% effect of that stock return. So and then we talk about excess return. So yeah, it's about 10. It's not that small. It's 1%. Right. So the excess return is so it's excess return itself is already a percentage, right? Like the stock return is like say 10%. Subtract 3% risk-free return, that's 7%. And this saying that if beta increased by 1, your excess return would increase by 0.15%. That's what it says. Right? So beta. So okay, if you are from economics, this is something that you would not be used to. In finance, the common practice is to report T-stack in parentheses, whereas in economics, the common practice is to report standard errors. Right? Now, the two are related. I mean, from statistics, you know the two are related, and it's just practice. Right? It comes down to the discipline's common practice. In finance, these numbers are all T-stacks, right? So remember T-statistics, what is the norm for statistical significance at 5% threshold? What's the T-stack? 1.96, right? So this makes it, so in some sense, this makes it easier to interpret the result because all you need to look for is whether the number in absolute value is larger than 1.96 or not. Right. Okay. So let's start. First, bad news for CAPM. Beta has essentially no effect on excess return. Right. So what this says is that higher correlation with market return does not guarantee higher return. Right. So when the market goes up, your stock also goes up. Your market goes down, your stock goes down. But on average, your stock return is not really that high. Right? So this is low. And it's mainly statistically insignificant. Right? The T-stack is quite small, 0.46. Right? So each row is one regression. Right? Each row is one regression. So this is the first regression. This regression is pure CAPM. Right? We're not saying that there are other factors that have taken away the effect of CAPM. This is actually saying CAPM by itself is not really holding. Right? So this is pure CAPM, and it has pretty much no effect. Next, this is just excess return of a stock regressed on the log of market equity. So that's the size of a company. Size has a significant effect. You can see it's negative, which means the bigger you are, the lower return you have. Because this is in log, you can interpret it in percentage terms, right? If your market capitalization goes up by 1%, on average, your excess return goes down by 0.15%. Right? If you extrapolate, the effect is actually quite strong. Think about it, right? It's quite normal for one company to be will be 100% bigger or even 10 times bigger, right? Right? If you compare Apple to other companies, it's huge, right? So if you extrapolate this effect, then this would actually be quite strong. If my company is like twice as big as yours in market capitalization, right? That means that this would then like yeah, then oh no, actually sorry, yeah, that's wrong, because one is actually 100%. Yeah, so if my company is 100% bigger than you, then the effect is 0.1 is negative 0.15%. So if my company is 10 times bigger than you, then the effect would be negative 1.5%. Yeah, so the independent variable is log of market capitalization. So the interpretation is if this value goes up by 1, that means that's 100% bigger, right? That's the interpretation. Because when you remember when you do we 0.15%, right? Because what you're having here is let's just say Ri equals to alpha plus something like gamma log MEI, right? And if you do DRI, log like so how do d log ME. So typically how do you do this? Do d log ME, d log ME, right? Right. Then this would just be gamma, right? But then to interpret this, you would just that becomes DRI 1 over MEI DMEI, right, equals to, right? So this is percentage change, right? Right. Yeah. Right, because this is change in ME over ME. So that's percentage change. So that's saying that, right? So this is the change. This is percentage change, right? So a value of 1 would mean going up by 100%, right? Yeah. So if you this is a percentage. 1 means 100%. So if this value when this value goes up by 1, then you get this effect. Okay, so okay. Book to market, significant effect, highly significant. So it's same interpretation, positive. So positive effect. Book to so this is book to market, right? Book to market, BE over ME. So these are all just individual. You have also they basically tie every variation here, right? Try booking beta and log M. If you put beta and market equity together, then market equity is significant. Here's one evidence that shows you that the CAPM itself is highly inadequate. In that you can actually see that the statistical significance of beta has gone up, although it's in the wrong direction though. So it's still not significant, but it has gone up, right? So another thing to note is that if you put market equity, book to market, earnings, this is a dummy. This is so the reason is they did is this. because earnings sometimes is negative. So they have to figure out a way to deal with that. So what they have is this number, E plus, is going to be earnings if earnings is positive, and it's going to be 0 if earning is 0 or negative. So right, this number will be 0 for any companies that have negative earnings. Right. So they have dummies, and they have this captures the magnitude. So what they note is that earnings actually is not statistically significant once you control for market equity and book to market ratio. This is the basis of the Fama-French three-factor model. Is that in this paper, Fama and French finds that it seems like you only need market equity and book to market ratio and not earnings. Right? So they don't have that in the three-factor model. They only have these. These two seems to be sort of somewhat independent. They each have their own effect. If you put them together, they are still statistically significant, right? So beta doesn't seem to make much of a difference. Market equity very important. Book to market ratio very important. Some other measures not very important, right? So after Fama-French 1992 comes Fama-French 1993, which is the most important empirical finance paper probably in that period of time. This is the paper that proposed the Fama-French three-factor model, which is the standard of is the baseline for any empirical finance research since then. Okay, so now the idea is this. Now, small cap stocks and value stocks are having abnormal excess return relative to CAPM. And CAPM is a very simple model. Perhaps CAPM is too simple. CAPM says that the only thing matters is market risk. Perhaps that's wrong. Maybe there are other risk factors that also matter to investors. So your model, if you use CAPM, that's too simple. Let's add in more risk factors. Remember, Eugene Fama is in the rational camp, right? He is the one who proposed efficient market hypothesis. So to him, whenever there's different returns, it must be due to risk. So let's have a more sophisticated model. And the idea is what we're going to look for is value stocks and small caps are each exposed to common factors not shared by growth large cap stocks. So these small companies, they have some specific risk that is common among themselves, but not to other companies, right? Similarly, companies that have large book to market ratio is exposed to some specific risk that is not shared by other companies, right? And we try to capture that. So how do we capture that? Well, simple, right? If we think that the risk is common among these companies, let's just use this company's return as a proxy to the risk. So that's the three-factor model. So the way Fama and French calculated these factors they use the U.S. stock market. The model works as the following. You have the standard CAPM plus two more terms. SMP is a small minus big factor that captures the risk of small companies. High minus low HMO captures the risk of high book to market firms So how is this calculated? Right. This is how it works. So Fama and French split all companies in their data into 6 groups. They sort them separately, first by market equity. So split the companies into 2 groups. Half of now I have to half is not accurate. What it does is this: they split all NYSE company into 2 halves, equal halves. Half the NYSE companies goes to the big group. So the biggest company, so the group above median right, go to big. The group below median in market capitalization go to small. Now, that's only for NYSE. Companies in NASDAQ and AMEX are sorted according to the cutoff of NYSE. So this cutoff is half and half NYSE. Similarly, these cutoff are half NYSE. Sorry, not half. Sorry, half could not have three halves. This is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 by NYSE. And then all the other companies are from the other exchanges are simply sorted according to the cutoff calculated from NYSE, right? So it's not truly equal size. It's not truly equal size because it's the sort is done by NYSE, right? So why did they do that? The reason is because the company sizes are not equal, are not randomly spread across the three exchanges. If you split companies, regardless of which exchange they come from, then what you would get is companies from one exchange would be concentrated in one group, and companies from other exchange would concentrate in another group. So they don't want that. Like so NYSE is the biggest, so they sort it by NYSE. So they're such that they ensure that you have NYSE firm in different places, right? So you split them into different groups. Small minus big is the simple average of top three minus bottom three. So what you do is simply so remember these risk factors are returns, right? So SMB is the simple average of R low BE plus R MBE plus high MBE minus 1/3 R okay. Oh, actually, sorry. Yeah, why did I already have symbols for that? So why did I just not use those symbols? Okay, R SL plus R SM plus R SH, right? Minus 1/3 R BL plus R BM plus R BH. It's really like that. So it's simple average. So it's not value weighted. It's simple average, and it's the return. Right? So the factor depends on the return. The factor is not depends on the size of the company. Factor depends on return. Right? So the idea is to capture the return that the market demands for this particular risk factor. Right? So for this particular risk. So it's so SMB is actually the difference in returns, right? The difference in average return. Similarly, the HML would be 1/2 RSH plus RBH minus 1/2 RSL plus RPL. That's it. Simple average. Right, simple average. Within the portfolio, it's gone, huh? Now for the other, within the portfolio, I believe it's, if I remember correctly, it's value weighted though. It's value weighted. So across portfolios, it's simple average, but within portfolio is value weighted. Okay, so you can download this from Kenneth French website, or you can download it from WRDS, so you don't need to calculate them yourself. Okay, so there are a lot of details in how the matching is done. As I said, to ensure that the accounting information is adequately known in public, they would force a certain delay before they use the data. Like as I said, you won't use, even if there's an announcement yesterday, you won't use that. You would use that one, the one previous, the one before it. You would I think they kind of like, they gotta do this. If your data, I actually have it in the like in the previous exam and in some of the assignments. Basically, you would have, they would always use the kind of enforce a kind of at least a 6 months delay, but it's variable. And there's a minimum delay, but because the financial statements don't come continuously, so sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter. So we will get more into the details on that when we actually get a handle of the data. Okay. So, but the idea is you're going to use this, you're going to construct these two factors, which are simple averages of the returns of these portfolios, right? Okay. The next, besides the construction of the factors, there's another practice that has become standard since Fama-French 1993. That is the use of 25 portfolios for testing whether your model how well your model does. So this practice becomes standard since Fama-French 1993. And what it does is this: you sort all your stocks into 25 portfolios. You need five categories of size, 5 categories of sizes, and 5 categories of book to market ratios. So you sort all stocks into 25 groups, right? So you have ranges from small to big stocks, and low book to market to high book to market. So you have 25 portfolios. All right, and then you look at whether your model, in this case, because this is the first one to do this, it looks at whether there is significant alphas, right? Whether there's significant alphas with a particular model. So with the CAPM model, these are the alphas, the value of the estimated alpha, the vertical intercept in the model, right? So this one, the alpha for CAPM. And the way unfortunately, the way the paper report, this is reproduced from the paper, is that they separate they have one table for the value and another table for T-stack. Right. So I'm showing you the table for the values for the alpha, the actual values of the alpha. And what you notice here is that the alpha, the estimated alpha is actually quite high for extreme cases, right? So you can say CAPM is doing fine in somewhere here, right? But CAPM is doing pretty poorly towards the extreme end, right? So Fama-French, with 2 more factors, did a better job in eliminating the alphas. First, the magnitude is smaller. You can see that from here. The magnitudes are way smaller in most cases. And they are also mostly statistically insignificant if you check the original paper, right? So you can see that's way smaller. So with the inclusion of 2 additional factors, the model is able to capture what seems to be abnormal return. Now, that's not too surprising, given that we know that there's such correlation exists, right? From the very first diagram that I've shown you, you know that there's such correlation, and you construct the factor to capture the correlation. So it's not surprising that you will be able to remove what seems to be a normal return when you do this, right? So the model works great when you think about not having alpha, right? So by adding in more terms in the back, we eliminate the vertical intercept, right? This is basically 0, which means your model, because this is thing you cannot explain, right? This is things you cannot explain. It's all in alpha. So when alpha is close to 0, that means your model pretty much explains everything, which is good as a model, right? That means that you can tell what's affecting the return of a particular stock, right? But what do the factors actually represent? What do the factors actually represent? Now, if you are Eugene Fama, then it's very simple. These factors represent risk, right? Risk. From the beginning to the end, that's what Eugene Fama believes, right? It's risk, right? So small companies must be more risky than big companies. Large companies, high book to market companies are more risky than low book to market companies. It's that simple. If you are inefficient market believer, then you would say these might be mistakes. Right? Investors somehow just not favor small companies for a variety of reasons, like perhaps you have never heard of them. The thing is, it's actually very hard to quantify what risk the factors represent. Like, I mean, Eugene Fama has suggestive explanations, but without much evidence, right? He's just saying that perhaps these companies are distressed, perhaps these companies blah blah blah, but it's not like a serious investigation of why such risk exists. Okay. So so here's an idea. What about looking at if these companies are actually risky? By the definition of risk, you would expect to see it showing up in form of lower return at some period, right? I mean, after all, if it never shows up, then it's not really risk, right? Risk means that sometimes goes up, sometimes goes down. If stock return always goes up, always positive, then it's not really risky. Okay. So there's this paper, Leconte-Koch at Ali, 1994, Journal of Finance, Contrarian Investment Extrapolation and Risk. It's not a direct test of Fama-French three-factor model or anything. It's published very close, 1994, but it's sort of evidence showing you that the idea that these stocks that have high return must have higher risk does not seem to hold. So in this paper, they look at two types of stock. Now, what they call value stocks are stocks that are so what they call value stocks are top 30% stock based on cash flow to price, and bottom 30% based on growth in sales. Right, so you have to sacrifice both criteria. Top 30% based on cash flow to price, and bottom 30% based on growth in sales. So these are big companies, right? Because that's why the growth in sales is slow. Like Apple now, right? Apple iPhone sales is not growing anymore, right? So that's kind of the idea. If your company is growing, if your company's growth in sales is very high, then you are not a value stock, but a growth stock. So these are basically big companies, generate a lot of cash and slow growth, kind of like Apple and Microsoft. Glamour stocks, the other way around. Bottom 30% in terms of cash flow, so not having a lot of cash, but top 30% based on growth in sales. Right. Okay. So what they want to see? What they want to see is how often glamour stocks outperform value stocks. right? So fast-growing cash-strapped firms versus slow-growing cash-generating firms. Which one do better, right? So the diagram is very simple. 0 means the two are equal. If you are in the top, towards the top, you have value stocks doing better. Towards the bottom, glamour stocks did better. And what you see here is that it seems like you have from like the 1968 to the 1990, it looks like value stock has consistently done better, except in 3 years. Well, so it's kind of hard to see where the risks are, right? So now here you have a category of stock that has higher return, right? The value stocks, and they are also the stocks that have consistently done better. Now, if it's risk, what you would expect if it's risk? If it's risk, you would expect something like this, right? Sometimes low, sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes high, sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes low, sometimes high. And kind of like that, right? It's risky because it's high and there are a lot of highs and lows, but on average, the highs are higher than how low the lows are. That is high return, high risk, right? That is high return, low risk, right? So it seems that there's no evidence that when a particular group of stocks in the stock market have high return, it represents high risk, because you see that there's no high risk throughout the 20-some years here. The value stocks have consistently done better, and there's not much downside to that. I would say, in general, if you're doing a finance paper looking for factors that can explain return, these days you don't really need to worry about whether it represents any particular risk or not. You just say, look, there's this factor, and it gives you high return. That's sufficient. Yeah. In this paper, they also looked at book to market and earnings per share, but they find that these factors are insignificant when regress with cash flow over price and growth over sales, right? So they that's somewhat different from the findings of Fama-French, because Fama-French find book to market to be more significant than cash flow. Okay. Now, Daniel and Titman, 1997, Journal of Finance. In some sense, this course looks a bit like a graduate level course in that we look in a lot of the research papers available. If you're interested in going to graduate school, then what an elective course in master's degree would look like this. You would have would be looking into research papers instead of textbook. So this paper, the idea is, if the factor represents risk, then we should see higher return for assets that are more correlated with the factors, right? The idea is, well, okay, your stock has high return because you are exposed to risk. If you believe this logic to be true, then the more exposed I am, the more return I should get, right? Yeah, that's the whole point, right? More exposure, more risky, more return. So is this actually true? Oops. So what they want to do is to look inside the trend within each of the 20 the size and book to market sort of portfolio, right? Remember in Fama-French you have this 25 portfolios, right? You want to look inside each of them, within each of them. So once again, you sort the stocks based on book to market and size, but now you have a third degree of sorting. Now in Fama-French you have 2 degrees of sorting, right? 2 dimension, size on the 1 dimension, book to market ratio in the other dimension. That's 25, right? Now you're going to do it with a third dimension, which is the correlation with the high minus low factor. So now you have a 3-dimensional table, right? 3-dimensional table, which will be easier to understand if you can represent a 3-dimensional table on an academic journal, but you can't, right? So you still have to represent it in a 2-dimensional table. So okay, here's what they have. Remember, it's a really a 3-dimensional sort, right? So here is the original 2-dimension. Because they have to sort it in 3 dimensions, they have to reduce the number of portfolios, right? If you do 25 and then you do additional 5, that's 75 groups. That's too few stocks per group. So instead, they reduced it to 3 times 3 times 5. That's 45, right? 45. So the idea is, okay, let's look within each of these size book to market sort, right? Look inside, and then within each of these portfolio, further sort the companies according to how correlated they are to the high minus low factor. That's the one earlier. Yeah, the one earlier, where you have the simple average of the return of the high book to market stock minus the simple return of the low book to market stocks. It's a fixed number for any given time period. Right. In any given time period, you take all the high book to market stocks, calculate the average return, and subtract from that the return of all the low book to market firms. Yeah. So it's a single number in any given period. It's just like market excess return. Yeah, market excess return is a single number for every single stock in concern at any given period, right? So it's the same idea. It's a kind of a market-wide factor, right? So you look at the correlation of each stock and to that factor and see, well, is there any significant variation across is there any do you see higher return for firms that are more correlated with the high minus low factor, right? So if you believe high exposure to risk means high return, then higher correlation is the definition of high exposure to risk, right? Higher correlation with a risk factor is the definition of high exposure to risk. So that should mean higher return. Actually, you don't see that. That's the point of this paper. Is that right? Regardless of whether a stock has low correlation with a risk factor or high correlation with a risk factor, in the end, there seems to be no difference in the average return, right? Right. So that seems to defeat the story of high return because of high exposure to risk, right? Because low correlation with risk factor, 0.74 on average. High correlation to risk factor, 0.8 on average. This is not statistically the significant difference. Right, it's quite it's not, there's no obvious. So as I said, these days I don't think that it's really important to argue about whether a specific factor is representing some risk or not. These days, if you're doing empirical finance, you just look for a factor and say, look, it statistically significantly predicts stock market return. That's good enough. You want to tack on some sort of explanation, like later on when we talk about some more behavioral papers, like if you find when the weather is bad, stock market goes down, which is actual paper, right? When weather is bad, stock market tends to go down. You find that effect. You still want to have a sort of explanation of why that is the case, right? But it's not essential to say, well, this is some sort of risk. Is the market efficient? That kind of thing is not very important to argue. So the summary. There is no evidence that Fama-French factors represent systematic risk. We simply don't see those companies that have high exposure to the Fama-French factors having very frequent ups and downs, right? So there seems to be no evidence of that. So the baseline is, I would say, Fama-French is an empirical model, right? The way that we realize that the book to market and market capitalization actually has a significant effect is we construct those factors because we know those factors have a significant effect, right? In Fama-French 1992, you see that they have significant effect. In earlier papers, we also know that. So Fama-French 1993 construct these factors with that knowledge in mind. So it's kind of empirical. You see that these factors have an impact, so you construct measures that capture these factors. It's not surprising that they explain the variation very well. So it's an empirical model.
Okay, so far we have talked about two factors. One is the value effect, which is the stock with high book-to-market ratios have higher return than low book-to-market ratios. And the second is the size effect, which is stocks with low market value have a higher return than those with large market value. So these are two effects that are commonly known, and there's a third one, which is called the momentum. Stocks that have done well over 3 months to 1 year in the past have high subsequent return. Right. Similarly, stocks that have done poorly recently tends to do poorly in the near future too. Right. So that's called momentum. Right. And of the three, momentum is the most troubling to Eugene Fama. Why?
Because if clients reflect on information, then the momentum effect should not exist.
So what makes the momentum? It's basically on the right track, right? What makes momentum more problematic, but value and size effect not? Why is size effect and value effect not problematic to Eugene Fama, but momentum effect is problematic?
Because it's not a risk.
Right, that's right. The problem is, whereas for the size effect and the value effect, you can explain away by saying that they represent some sort of risk. Momentum is not a risk, right? Momentum is a simple phenomenon where you see market predictability. What goes up tends to go up, what goes down tends to go down, and that's most problematic for Eugene Fama. But this effect is very apparent, so he kind of has no choice but to have to accept like this exists. Following momentum is reversal. Stocks that have done well in the past 1 to 4 years tends to earn low return. So what you see is sort of so if the stock has been doing well recently, it tends to keep doing well for a while, then it goes back down, right? So how do you see this? Now what we're going to see is a completely different method of testing financial anomalies relative to what we have seen just now. Now the ones we have already seen just now is kind of very standard economic analysis, right? You basically put in a bunch of factors, do a time series regression, and see whether the effect is statistically significant or not. In finance, there's a second way, which is portfolio formation. In each period, you form a portfolio based on a trading rule. You calculate the portfolio's excess return and compare the portfolio's excess return to some benchmark to see whether you have statistically significant higher return than the benchmark. So typically for stock portfolios, you would compare it to sort of a market performance, right? So if what you're going to do is buying stocks, then you compare it to S&P 500, right? So you would compare. Okay, my strategy involves active trading according to certain rules. The benchmark would be passively holding S&P 500, right? But this is only if you are using sort of a long only strategy, right? A strategy that only buys things, right? Because if you're doing a long short portfolio, then the market return would not be a good benchmark, right?
Just one quick question. To calculate excess return, what risk-free rate do you use?
U.S. Treasury, typically.
30-year T-bonds or 1
In
year?
Fama-French, they use 1 month. But 10 years is actually very common.
10 years.
10 years actually 10 years. So 10-year annual return is very common. But in the Fama-French, the paper we just talked about, they use 1 month TBU. This is a good question because despite the fact that they're supposedly all risk-free, the annualized return is not the same. Yeah. Okay, so now this is not just for academic research. When you are running a hedge fund, you also do this. You compare to your performance to a benchmark. Now, when you compare yourself to a benchmark, beating the benchmark is not the same as having positive return, because if the market's doing poorly, beating the benchmark might still you are doing poorly. It's just that you're doing better than the market, and that's actually what you see, right, in index tracking funds, right? What you're concerned about is whether it beats the index it tracks, not whether it actually necessarily gets positive return. So, for hedge funds and many finance research papers, you would be implementing what's called a market neutral portfolio. So supposingly you can do this with no money in your pocket. So the money you use to buy stocks is completely funded by the money you get from short selling stocks. So your actual position in dollar terms is 0 at the moment of purchase, right? So in that case, the benchmark is just 0, right? Because if you do nothing, you have nothing, right? You have no money to begin with, right? In some, it's kind of like, so for example, what you would do is you would long the top 10% stock that has gained the most value and short the bottom 10%, right? And the dollar amount you used to buy would be the same as the dollar amount you get from selling. A positive estimated effect would be representing money made out of thin air. That's the attractiveness of hedge funds, like this sort of long short portfolio, supposedly kind of generating money out of nothing. Now, in practice, obviously, you cannot actually short sell without any money. This is highly theoretical. In practice, short selling requires a margin account, right? You do have to have sufficient money in your account to cover any potential loss. Yeah. But in theory, yeah, the money you use to buy stocks come from the money you get from short selling stocks. All right. Now, here's something that is not specific to finance, but I think to data analysis in general is, now suppose we look at data from, let's say, look at data from the 1990s to year 2000, right? From 1990 to year 2000, and we discover there's a pattern that seems to be very profitable. So you want to check if it's statistically significant. Now, can you do that just with data from 1990 to year 2000? So you look at the data from 1990 to year 2000, right? So let's just say you have a timeline, right? Let's say this is 1990. Let's say this is year 2000. And you see that, let's say, you have some stocks that has been doing well pretty consistently, right? Right. Let's say these are, let's just say these are value stocks, right? Just for example, doesn't matter, right? So you have value stocks that have been, you see that from 1990s and 2000 they have been doing very well, right? So you want to see if this is statistically significant as a trading strategy. Is it valid to test that with data here?
You get more data to test.
Now, this is not valid as this is not now. You discover the pattern during this 10 years is not the fact that you find statistical significance within the same 10 years is not a validation of your trading strategy. It's just restating what you have discovered, right? You have noticed this exists, and you have verified that it actually exists. It's not a validation of a trading strategy. It's just reconfirming that your eyes actually work as intended, right? Okay, so as a data analysis principle, to validate that some pattern actually exists, you always have to test it with data that you have not yet looked at, right? You have to look at out of sample. You have to, this is very important. This is in sample. And to validate the pattern you discover actually exists, you have to look out of sample. This is a general data analysis principle. In principle, this is also what you should be doing in terms of social science research. What you should do is you have a hypothesis in mind, and then you go out to look for data, and you see whether your hypothesis is confirmed by the data. The key is that the hypothesis is formed before you look at the data, right? If you form your hypothesis after looking at the data, then any result you get is merely a confirmation that your observation it's there, right? It's not a valid statistical test, right? This is the overlook of this principle is what caused a lot of social science research to be unreplicable, because the researchers have looked at the data and discovered patterns and then confirm the pattern exists in the same data. The pattern might very well exist in the data because of noise, and you just happens to confirm that again, right? So a valid testing strategy is to discover a rule, test it with some other data that is not part of the data that you have used to discover the rule, right? Within finance, this is relatively easy to do because there's relatively abundance of data, right? The rule, you can always you discover, perhaps you discover rule. Now perhaps you look at the stock market recently and you discover a rule. Well, you can still try to do a back testing with historical data that you haven't looked at yet, right? The key is to go to data that you have not yet looked at and check that the rule also applies to those data, right? Now, whenever you're trying to validate something actually exists, this is what you should do. Out of sample, very important.
Why wouldn't you look at all the data to find the pattern at the beginning?
Because this effect is very strong in sample. And even if it does not exist out of sample, on average, it might still be statistically significant. Let's say this effect is so strong that it's like say significant at 0.001%, and then in the other sample there's actually no effect, right? It's perhaps something like 15 or 20%. It's still possible that on average as a whole the effect is significant at the 5% level, right? But that would not be it would not be valid to say the effect actually exists elsewhere, because it does not. Right. So a standard, it's a good question, because you would probably think about we are throwing away data, right, when we do this. Yeah. Yes, but that is necessary. To get true out of sample test, you have to throw away data. There are ways to minimize the amount of data you throw away. Now, so this is now we're getting into more data science field. In data science, the typical norm is to do now you discover the rule with about 80% of the data, and you validate with 20% of data. This is possible because in data science, you typically only work on things that you have a lot of data. 20% typically already represents a lot of data in data science. There are in cases where your data is so precious that you can't do such simple split because there's not enough data. You would do something that is called what do you call k-fold cross-validation, or take one out, leave one out validation. And instead of doing a simple split where you have 80, 80, 20, what you're going to do is this. I have my data. I split it into 5 parts, right? Instead of running the regression once, I'm going to, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? I will run it 5 times. In sample, I use 1, 2, 3, 4, and then out of sample, I use 5. Then I rotate 1, 2. That probably, if I want to rotate, probably a more systematic way would be something like 5, 1, 2, 3, out of sample 4. 4, 5, 1, 2, out of sample 3, and then 3, 4, 5, 1, out of sample 2. This minimizes the amount of data you use, because you can keep increasing the number of folds. You can make it 10 if you need to, right? That would keep as much data as possible in the stage where you discover a rule. Now, in data science, you don't usually use your eyes to find the rules. It's all automatic, right? So that's why your algorithm would find a rule within the data here, and you test the rule with the data you keep up. If your data is very precious, keep increasing the number of folds so that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and only using 10% of the data to do our sample test. But then you have to run the regression 10 times, right? Yeah. But this is in the data science area. So if you're interested, I would say these days I would highly encourage you to take a course in either data science or machine learning in the computer science department, because it's very practical. If you go to work and you need to analyze data, this is something you need to know. Okay, so we start from the evidence of momentum and reversal. So this is from Jigadash and Titman, 1993, which we talked about last week. What they did is that they buy stocks with the highest return in the past 6 months, and at the same time they short sell stocks with the lowest return, right? So this is a long short portfolio. Theoretically, you're not using any money. Now, of course, as we have mentioned, in practice, in order to short sell stocks, you would have to have money, right? So they have a long short portfolio, and the numbers here, they are percentage return. So 1 means 100% return, right? 1 means 100% return. And as usual in finance, the numbers within the parentheses are T-stacks, right? So if you look at the first year, right? So the columns are the rows are months, and each column is 1 year. So you can see that in the first year, except for the first month, for month 2 to month 12, you get positive returns from this long-short portfolio, right? So you are earning something out of nothing because basically you're getting your money from selling things you do not have, and then you use the money to buy something else, right? And out of that exercise, you somehow manage to earn positive return, which you can keep. So here you have positive returns from month 2 to month 12. Now, not every single month is statistically significant. The initial months have very strong statistical significance. But you can see by month 12, it's very weak. If you look at the cumulative return, that simply adds up all the returns from each month, right? Just accumulates some returns from each month. You can see that it's statistically significant because of how strong the effect is initially, right? So it's statistically significant. In fact, the effect, because of how much you have accumulated in terms of gains initially, you are still statistically earning some positive return all the way to the 22nd month, right? This number is still statistically significant and positive, right? Although by then, this is what you're getting is 5% cumulative return, which is a lot worse than what you'd be getting somewhere around the 1 year mark, which is almost 10%. Right? So that's why the momentum effect is usually described as saying that with stocks that have been doing well, they tend to do well within a year. Right? The maximum return, maximum cumulative return is achieved at around 11 or the 12th month, right? Yeah, with up 9.5% return in a long-short portfolio. Right? Okay, so the cumulative return starts dropping because of the fact that monthly return has become negative by the 13th month. Now these are all, remember, so we are talking about not one single stock, right? We're talking about you're buying a portfolio of stocks that have been doing well, short selling a portfolio of stocks that have been doing poorly. So we are talking about quite a number of stocks. And what you're seeing here is that in the portfolio, when you do this long short portfolio, the return you're getting starts becoming negative in the second year. And it basically stays negative all the way to the 31st month, and then in the 32nd, it becomes kind of basically zero. Right? In fact, none of these are particularly statistically significant. As you can see, the t-stats are all very small, mostly very small. So unlike gains, right? The gains you can see very strong t-stats, but the losses you don't actually see that strong t-stats. But it does add up. You can see the cumulative return goes down on average, right? It never actually goes all the way to negative, as you can see. Even by the third year, by the end of the third year, the coefficient is still positive, although it's definitely not statistically significant. So basically, for all we care, it's pretty much zero, right? So within a year, stocks that have been doing well tends to do well, and then afterwards, it starts to go back down, and there is no difference in the long run. There's no difference, right? So that's momentum and reversal. Now, momentum reversal presents us with the same issue, which is predictability. Like here, it doesn't seem like it's a risk factor. It simply looks like the market has some particular trend of moving. So and it seems like it's something you can take advantage of. Now, right? So given that stocks that have been doing well tends to do well in the near future, then a valid strategy would be to buy stocks that have been doing well, and if you can, short sell stocks that have not been doing well, right? So this is in fact a profitable strategy, So how do you explain the existence of momentum? And right, how do you explain the existence of momentum? Now, one way you can explain why momentum might exist is that you can imagine you have a world where you have two groups of investors. One group it's called news watchers, and the others would be momentum traders. So the model works like this. Imagine you have an infinite period model. This is mostly just for convenience in derivation. You have one group of news watchers who basically receive information about the stock. There are multiple generations of momentum traders. So at each period, you have some momentum traders entering the market, and they do not receive information other than the movement of stock price. They just look at stock price. There's one unit of stock, so there's limited quantity of the stock. Which is why the price would fluctuate, because price get bid up or down depending on the demand. The supply is fixed. Risk-free rate is assumed to be 0, mostly just for convenience. The way the model works is news watchers receive news about the value of the stock slowly. Now, it's important that they receive this information about the stock slowly, because if they don't, then you would have a sudden jump in price rather than a gradual rise in price. So this is essentially where the momentum is coming from, the fact that people get news slowly. So that gives you a slow increase in price, right? Until the news is completely known, right? So yeah, the way it works is over time. This is the price of the stock, and initially there's this is the initial price. There's some news here, but the news don't get known by everyone. If it does, then it was just like that, right? But if the news is spread slowly, then you would have something like this, okay? Right? At some point, the news is completely known. So if you have just if you are in a world with just news watchers, this is what happens, right? With just news watchers, initial price, some news, price goes up slowly as the news spreads because demand slowly increases as more people hear about the news. And then at some point, everyone knows about the news, then the price stays there, right? This is good news. If it's bad news, then it's just the other way around, right? Bad news is just the other way around, right? So that's what happens. Now, what you get is momentum, but you don't get reversal, right? Because if these guys are rational, so they heard about the news, they rationally evaluate the value of the stock. So if it's good news, then right. So this is good news. If this is good news, then they just rationally determine what stock is worth, and then the price goes up. And there's no reason why it should go back down unless there is bad news. Okay. So the assumption here is that in this particular model, is that they hold the stocks forever, right? There's no particular reason that you need this obviously no one holds stocks forever. You eventually liquidate, but for the purpose of the model, it's probably fine, right? We're talking about momentum and reversal are effects within a few years, so it's probably fine. There are people who hold stocks for longer than that. Right, so then there's a second group called momentum traders. And what the momentum trader does is that they just look at movement of stock price and buy when prices are going up and sell if prices are not, sell if the prices are down. Now in this model, they first make the assumption that the momentum trader stays in the market for a fixed number of periods. So whereas the news watcher stays forever, the momentum traders stays for a fixed number of periods. This is to capture the idea that they're short-term investors. So in this model, long-term means infinite. Short-term means a certain fixed number of periods. They need this. The paper needs this because they want, right? They want the price to go back down when there is no more momentum from the news watchers. Now, this is just the news watchers. Flat, up, flat, right? Flat, slowly up, flat. Now, it would, when you have momentum traders, when they see the price going up, then they would drive up the price because they simply look at the movement of price and decide whether to buy. So this part is simple. They just, yeah, that's simple. The thing is, you want reversal, right? If the momentum traders don't exit, then you don't actually necessarily get reversal. The reversal comes in because these guys who buy initially, they would eventually sell, right? Because the assumption is they stay for a fixed number of periods. So these guys who have purchased a lot of the stocks because they have seen the price going up, eventually they would start selling because by assumption they have to exit the market at a certain point. This gives the model some sort of sell pressure, right? That's why the price goes back down, because these people want to be gone, right? If they stay forever, then it won't go back down, right? So the reversal comes from these guys start exiting, because so each generation of momentum traders comes in, see that the price has been going up, and they want to buy further. When the news is completely known, there is no more momentum from the news watchers, right? There's no more momentum from the news watchers. Now, which means that at this point, there's really no reason why the price should go up further. The momentum traders would come in and see that there's not much more movement, and their demand would be lower or perhaps even zero because there's no price movement. And then at some point, these guys start exiting. That gives you the sell pressure, so that the price goes back down. Right. So that's why you need them to be investing only for fixed number of periods. So here you have momentum traders buying, right? And there are many generations of them. Here you start having momentum traders selling. To be more accurate, they're exiting the market by assumption. Right, so once again, there are multiple generations of them all leaving. Right. The assumption in the model is that the momentum traders really myopic in some sense. They really just look at the movement of stock price at the moment of their purchase. Right. In some sense, that's necessary because the model is already very complicated mathematically as it is, given how much you have to consider. So they make even this very simple assumption that the momentum traders are simply looking at the movement of stock price already make the model very complicated mathematically, right? But you do get a very nice shape where when there's underlying reason for the stock price to go up, momentum traders push it up further, and when there's no more underlying reason for the stock price to go up, momentum traders eventually quit, driving the price back down. This paper, unless you really like math, then otherwise it's not very rewarding in reading because the math is quite complicated.
Are these theories of empirical? So you look at real life data?
No. This paper, so the momentum, the empirical paper is like the one I've shown you initially, right? Gigadesh and Titman. That's an empirical paper, no theoretical content. It's just documenting that there is such an effect exists. This one is a purely theoretical paper. Yeah, it's a purely theoretical paper, so there is no data involved. It's just all math. Right, so they just say, we know there's this phenomenon exists, momentum and reversal, right? How do we explain that? I'm not sure. I don't think they even do a realistic calibration of the parameters, right? So they just show you that theoretically this can exist, right? Right. So okay. So I've already illustrated the logic. Good news, when a good news is spreading, news watchers gradually push price up. Entering momentum traders push the price further up because they see that the price has been going up. News watchers start pushing the price up after the good news is fully known at this point. In the second point, price stops increasing. Existing momentum traders start exiting. Eventually, so new traders have low demand. So as old momentum traders exit the market, price inevitably drops. So one thing that you might find is unrealistic is that, as I said, the assumption is that the momentum traders are really myopic. They really their demand only depends on the stock price movement at the moment of their purchase. So let's just say I'm this guy, right? I see that at that moment the price is going up, so I have high demand. And the assumption in the model is you would have high demand all the way until you exit. I think it's mostly for mathematical simplicity, right? I mean, if it's more realistic as a momentum trader, I would have varying demand depending on whether the price has been moved or how the price has been moving. But I think that would probably make the math too complicated. So it's easier just to assume that each generation's demand is fixed at the moment of the purchase. That makes the math easier. And I guess in some sense it's okay because you can say, right, when you say this generation exit and another generation of momentum trader replace this older generation, you can kind of think of them as just the same guys, right? It's just that I've updated my belief. So it's okay in that sense. Like I only update as a momentum trader, I only update my belief once in a while. That would give you the same effect. I'm here initially, I see that the price has been going up, so I believe the price is going to keep going up. I don't revise my expectation for quite a while, and at some point I realize probably that's not what I believe is wrong. So I see to the new reality, then I sell, right? And I have a lower demand.
Other than momentum traders exiting, is it possible whether there's a news watchers realize that the prices are too high? It's sort of like a bad news, and then they start selling to push it back to the.
Well, the thing is, in this model, this model, you can see that actually the price would never drop below what the news watchers think it's worth. It only goes higher and then goes back down to what the news watchers. In the long run, if nothing else happens, then the price eventually will settle at what the news watchers think it's worth. So it doesn't actually have overreaction in this model. That's one. Okay. I guess, well, this is an overreaction. So it doesn't actually, it doesn't have like a pendulum going or the other way around. It doesn't go up and then overreact and going back down. It doesn't. In this model, it's only one way. When there's a good news, the stock price overshoot and then go back down to the rational level. It doesn't actually go under, which is why the news watchers have no incentive to sell.
I'm wondering, instead of the momentum traders pushing it back down to the long run equilibrium, is it possible that the news watcher will be pushing it down?
So I guess if perhaps you're asking whether it's possible if these guys are like real investors, truly rational, they would probably sell here and then buy back again. Yeah, that's realistic, but it's not in the model. Yeah, it's not in the model. I think it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that someone would try to do that. Now, I think the reason why it's not incorporated is mostly because the math would be too complicated. Because dealing with the expectation of all these dynamics is very difficult, right? Because everyone is kind of rational. Like they just have different assumptions here, right? These guys just look at the news and decide what to do. Those guys, the momentum traders, look at the price movement and decide what to do, right? I would say, yeah, there would be a value in making the news watchers smarter, and if they can actually sell here and buy back, it would actually probably generate some more interesting dynamics. But the math is going to be hard. Yeah. So, I guess it's also I think the evidence of overshooting is very strong. Whether it actually overcompensate is not very clear. We do know that in the long run, all stocks tend to converge to a sort of a long run rate of return, right? So in the short run, many stocks diverge. Some do very well, some do very poorly. Assuming that stocks doesn't actually go bankrupt, then all these stocks eventually kind of go back to the same level in return. So no stock, there usually won't be a stock where it just keeps going up. Like the return just keep going up, never going back down. It doesn't make too much sense either, right? A stock that persistently have higher return than the average should warrant a higher price, right? If you know that every stock, on average, let's say on average, stocks have return of 10%, and you have a stock that consistently have 15%, with no particularly higher risk to speak of. There's no reason why you shouldn't just switch all your money to the stock with 15% return. And if you do that, it should push up the price of the stock with 15% return, lowering its return. So the dynamics of a market should push stock return to a long run return rate. Yeah, eventually. So we do. So it's not very clear where it actually just overcompensate. It's not very clear. So I guess there's no compelling reason for them to include in this model, because no one is actively seeking a model for that. Right? People want a model for momentum. People want a model for reversal, but I don't think anyone is particularly looking for a model which there is clear overcompensation for the overshoot. Yeah.
What does it mean by overcompensation?
It's like something like this. I don't think anyone is looking for a model where you have this sort of dynamics, where it actually goes. Now, if the news watchers try to sell, you might actually have something like that. Right? Because now you have even more sell pressure. So it might happen, but I don't think anyone's particularly looking for a model that has this particular effect. And so, which is why I think they are fine with a model that only overshoots and goes back down to rational level, and not having this at all. Right. Okay, so I have this. All right. Okay. So, right. So, yeah, I basically talked about all that already. So, okay. So now the Gigadesh and Titman model shows you that there is momentum. Now, this paper, Chen Wesley, this one, stock price reaction to news and no news, drift and reversal after headlines. This one separates. This one separates the winning stocks from the losing stocks and report them separately. In Gigadesh and Titman, they just do a long short portfolio and report to you what they get from that, right? So it's kind of like what a hedge fund would do. We buy something, we short sell something, and I just report to you what return I'm getting. Here, they separate the returns from the winning stocks and the losing stocks, so that you see what's happening in each of those portfolios. What they do is they specifically so here is so you can see. So panel A is just like Gigadesh and Titman, where you have a long short portfolio. Panel B is just the winning stocks. Panel C just the losing stocks, right? So they separate these to let you know what's going on. They also have stocks that have news, right? So basically, I think they are looking at news. Perhaps I think they are probably looking for, it's defined as kind of stocks that have appeared on the Wall Street Journal or something, right? So basically, stocks. The first column here, stocks that have been on newspaper. Second column, stocks that have not been on newspaper. So you just simply do a keyword search. This is not too hard to do. So what you do is you just log into the library's, connect to the library's network, look for Factiva, so Fativa. So this is basically a portal for all newspapers in the world. You just you include things like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, that kind of stuff, and then you just search for the name of the company. That's exact. This is probably done by some poor RA. I have done that before. I've done that. Not for this paper, but I've done this as an undergrad. Basically, yeah, it's an undergrad sitting in the library, just searching for different company names and see how many news and what dates they appear. Yeah, so this is probably, that's how it's done. Those with news, those with no news, and the difference between stocks with news and no news, right? Yeah, so in finance, you get really large tables like that. Yeah, it's very common to what they have. You have very large tables. Okay. All right. So the first thing to notice is that, right. So now these are percentage returns, right? You can see these are actual percentage. For when a stock when a stock that is doing well is on the news, you get very high return on the day, well, initially, and then it's still positive all the way to 36 months. No news, still very strong performance initially, because this is strong because we're picking, these are winning stocks, right? So this is the initial effect, because that's how well they're doing. Subsequently, besides the first 3 months, it's still doing pretty well. It's doing well. So good stock, good performing stocks do well. Good performing they do well regardless of whether they are on the news or not. So the difference between being on the news and not being on the news, conditional on you have been doing well in the past, it's not statistically significant. The T stacks up. Right. So basically, do well. If you are doing well, you do well, regardless of whether you're on news or not. Now here's what happens with losing stocks. Losing stocks performs poorer if they are on the news, right? So you can see, you can actually see what happens here. Now these are poor stocks. These are loser stocks that have been on the news, right? So their returns were negative on average. These were loser stocks that were not on the news, and their returns were actually not negative, which is why the difference when you have one number that's on the positive side, the other number is on the negative side, the difference is going to be very large and it's statistically very significant, right? So loser stocks is what's driving the effect, right? If you look at the T stacks, right? For winner stocks, the T stacks are actually not statistically significant, right? For stocks on the news, it is somewhat statistically significant for those not on the news. If you look at a longer duration, but in the short term, it's also not very significant. Right? But for losing stocks, you can see that the T stacks are quite large. So what this shows you is that the losers are really losing. Yeah. This is not the only case that you'll kind of see something like that. Because this paper is kind of in the middle of two topics that we can talk about. So one is momentum, right? Because they're looking at the momentum here. This is momentum, but they're also looking at the effect of news, which we talk about again when we reach analyst recommendation. So basically, it's generally true that when it comes to news, negative news have a much stronger effect than positive news. This is generally true. So when a stock receive a negative analyst recommendation, right? it would also have this very strong effect. Negative effect is very strong. So it's kind of essentially it's kind of this, like good news is not really news. Bad news is bad news. Yeah. So this is also showing that bad news is bad. Good news is not necessarily having a very strong effect. Okay. Okay, so I think to conclude this section, section of the course. So what is a profitable trade? Now, if you have a simple model like CAPM in mind, a profitable trade is to find stocks with positive alpha. So basically, you're looking for returns that are not explained by the model. Now, with more complicated model, like the Fama-French three-factor model, we might be able to explain away most systematic variation in profit, right? So profitable trades would become less and less dependent on finding alpha because initially with a very simple model, any return you cannot explain would be in the intercept of the model. But now you have a very complicated model which captures many aspects of the market. Then if your model actually does very well, then you won't actually find a very significant intercept to speak of. Right. So from an academic finance economist perspective, like John Cochrane, right, University of Chicago economist, in his AFA address, so what did he say? He was in the year he was the president of AFA, American Finance Association, right? Presidential address. So he said, like, I tried telling a hedge fund manager, you don't have alpha. Your return can be replicated with a value growth, momentum, currency, and term carry and short-term volatility strategy. Is that right? So exotic beta is my alpha. Right? I understand those systematic factors and know how to trade them. My clients don't. And so that's the response of the hedge fund manager. Right? And he has a point. So basically, now what you generally think of as abnormal return can very often be explained as systematic factors. Right? When you don't know what those factors are, you call them alpha, abnormal return. When you know what they are, they become exotic beta. Like just weird factors that you can capture, right? So here and it also sums up very well what we know, right? Value growth, right? There's a value growth difference in return. There's a momentum effect. We haven't talked about currency. We didn't talk about currency and term carry. This is actually also in Fama-French 1993. They have actually had more than 3 factors. The 3-factor model has become the standard, but they actually have 5 factors in that paper. They have also have other factors in that too. If you're interested, so if you're interested there, so basically these are the systematic factors that generally recognize, and the strongest being the ones that we talk about. Okay, so
do they still exist, even though that we already know?
Good question. I'll say yes. I think it's very persistent. Which is exactly why I think particularly momentum is so disturbing for Eugene Fama, because it looks so obvious, so easy to profit from it, yet it still exists. Right. So somehow the market has not eliminated these effects. It's quite it still looks somehow it's just very fundamental. It just exists. Furthermore, in markets that are less efficient than the United States, the effect could be even stronger. Right? United States is a relatively efficient market, So a lot of the strategies might stop working eventually, right? Things like, for example, things like weather patterns, that kind of, we will talk about those later on. There are some smaller factors, some smaller exotic factors that have effect. Those effects probably go away eventually as people learn about their existence. But these are quite fundamental. For some reason, they persist. Yeah. And if you look at Hong Kong, a lot of these factors would work, for much longer time than the United States. Yeah. Perhaps one possibility is that perhaps the amount of institutional trading is not as high in Hong Kong as in the United States. In the United States, most of the trades are dominated by institutional trading, and perhaps that makes them market more efficient than Hong Kong. All right, so we're going to talk about exact portfolio exercise in a moment.